We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the ground we stand on and thank them for allowing Papa to tell stories on these glorious lands we share.
Our guest on this episode has been a steady force in Australian broadcasting ever since she joined the ABC all the way back in 1990. You'll know her face and voice instantly. They both carry that unmistakable blend of authority, empathy, and a deep curiosity about people from all walks of life. With a childhood spent jumping between continents and cultures, she has a unique outlook on life. Dear Indira Naidoo, welcome to Three Feed Memories.
It's wonderful to be here, Selma.
This Dear Indira, you use it on all your handles and in other places of your life. Where does it come from? It feels like not an agony aunt, it feels like an advice column.
I didn't really realise until I started broadcasting and I would say my name, Indira, and the bit of my name that people would connect with or recognise was the dear. And of course, it's not spelt dear, D-E-A-R, it's spelled D-I-R-A, Indira. But it just kept on resonating all the time, Indira. And people would make a play on the name as well. So because it was, especially 30 years ago, an unusual name to see in Australian media, that Indian name. So people would play on it. So I would get people not being able to pronounce it correctly and say, instead of Indira Naidoo, they'd say Indira I do, or Indira I don't mind if I do. And it just kept on playing and playing with all of that. And so when Gmail first came out and I was travelling overseas for an extended period of time and I wanted to set up a Gmail account, and advice from a friend who had just done it, she said, look, Indira will have been taken, Naidoo would have been taken, and you don't want, 1, 2, 3, everyone has those sorts of, find a handle for your Gmail, it wasn't even called a handle then, that you're not going to have to keep changing because other people have sort of got it. And so I was sitting there with Indira thinking, well, what could be my Gmail, email address? And I just thought, dear. Why don't I just put Dear Indira?
And here come all the fan mail now.
Yeah. And so over 25 years, it's just been riffs on that for, all the social media obviously now and everything else. So it's stuck. And I realised that your name, of course, for everyone, your name becomes very significant. But I think my name has almost become a short form. You don't really need to know much else about me.
Like Madonna.
Like Madonna, darling. But just Indira, it is the only sort of calling card I need. So I'm quite lucky to have a name that in a place like Australia is unique. Of course, if I had stayed or grown up in parts of Africa or India, I would be Jane Smith. It would be the most common name in the world. But I ended up in a country where Indira Naidoo, when I first started broadcasting, was quite an unusual name.
When you did start broadcasting 30 years ago, what was that landscape like for a young cadet journalist coming in with a name like Indira Naidoo?
This is what's so interesting. I didn't really see the unusualness of that. I've never really been anyone that's walked into a room and scanned it for people who are like me or look like me or sound like me. And so I never really did that in my newsrooms in the ABC when I first started. And again, though, it was, looking back on it, very unusual for someone who sounded and looked like me to be on national television. But I was just lucky it was an era where the ABC really took their cadets under their wing. You were very well supported and trained. It was a whole year. I mean, no one will believe this now. So even after you'd done your university training and your journalism graduation and everything, they spent another year with you, taking you to all the different parts of the ABC's broadcasting network. So as well as being an on-the-road reporter, you'd get to spend time with the investigative journalists at Four Corners in Sydney, the documentary makers in children's, on the play school set. You know, we used to do podcasts back then. People forget this, but we had a whole division of radio sound specialists and soundscaping, where as a cadet, your job was to walk on broken glass or pebbles to create soundscapes for their radio dramas and podcasts. So we had to do all of that as part of our training for that year, as well as learning the journalism, the writing, the voice work, all the different roles, the chief of staff, the production supervisor. So it was as thorough. In fact, I bumped into someone from the BBC last year who said in that era, the BBC saw the ABC cadet training program as one of the best in the world. And a lot of their programs, especially because we made it so broad, the BBC was if you came on as a radio journalist, you only got radio journalism training. But the ABC saw it as a much broader and geographically broader. You know, they moved us around the country. So we got to spend time in Alice Springs, in the Canberra Parliament House. So for a 21-year-old, it was the most extraordinary journalism education.
Have you shaped your journalism, or has your journalism shaped you?
I definitely feel that as I now look back at a 36, 37-year career, and all the journalists that came and started with me, and many of them we went to university together, I realised that I had a global view earlier than maybe a lot of my compatriots. So when I started in journalism or at uni when I was 17, 18, most of the students I was studying with had just come from a country town, and that had been their full life experience to that moment. And the way we learnt then, for me, was when we learnt about things, I could put it in a perspective that I now realise they probably couldn't. And so what's happened now is, as the last 10, 15 years of our careers, and I watch them and the work they're doing, I can see them now understanding some of those global aspects that we're now having to struggle with in the world in a really big way. But some of those elements I saw when I was 13. You know, I lived through a civil war when I was 13, 14, 15 in Zimbabwe, whereas most of the kids going to journalism, we had studied it but never really had that experience of it. So the variety of what I'd been exposed to, I think, was constantly moulding my journalism all the way through.
And why did you feel it important to tell these stories?
Everyone has a story to tell, and I think we can forget that. It's not just people who are important, not just people who are powerful or, have had awards or high achievement. Everyone has a story to tell. And I love it even when you're just in a shop getting a drink or a coffee or sitting at a bus stop. There is a story right there next to you, and a really interesting story, and a story that's going to have very big significance. But unless you ask that question, how are you going today? How did you get to work? Or, what's that coffee like? It could just seem like a very banal small talk question, but it can really lead to something very significant. And I think some of my best stories that I've told, or that I've had a chance to tell, have come from just being interested in someone else.
When you're sitting at that bus stop and you're sitting next to that person, are you compelled to ask them what they're reading or what they're doing or anything like that?
Yeah.
Is there something?
Always. I'm taking it all in all the time.
Do you get tired from it?
No, not at all. I find those actually very energising, those conversations.
It's very hard to sort of pigeon you into a single domain. Are you a broadcaster, a journalist, an author, an activist? What gives you the most joy?
That's the question I was going to ask you at the end of this interview. See, you are very good. I've just been thinking about that. I'm working on my next book at the moment, and we don't ask ourselves that question enough. So what gives you your most joy? And for me, it is almost always an interaction with nature. For instance, we've got a lot of bird life coming onto our balcony, and I put some tomato trellising in a pot plant, and all these rainbow lorikeets were fascinated by the trellis, and they started landing on it and swinging around it and pecking and fluffing up their feathers, and I was just completely captivated and just enjoying their joy at exploring this new bit of, structure that had come into their domain. We had the grandkids around on the weekend and we just all cooked up a big Sunday lunch. I love that experience of sharing food with family. So, yeah, it tends to be nature and food, gardening, being with animals, just watching dogs and cats, especially in Potts Point. Oh, my gosh.
Well, let's start with your first food memory.
Yeah.
This is one that's linked to mum
Yeah.
and heritage and culture. Mum's chicken curry with curry leaves, your go-to comfort dish.
Yeah, it is. I actually featured it in my second cookbook, The Edible City, because I hadn't featured any of her dishes. And obviously, especially with migrants and moving around, food and getting the ingredients and the food culture becomes very important to you and how you settle into a new place. So I thought I'd honour her with that recipe. Although, funnily enough, even though she gave me the recipe, when she saw it printed, she goes, I didn't say to put, half a teaspoon of coriander powder. I go, yes, you did. She goes, no, I would always never put that, and I would do half a teaspoon of this instead. So anyway, so it is very funny. There I was trying to honour her recipe, but then she was niggling over the coriander powder in it. But it's she said it would still taste delicious, which is fine. But that dish is special because it is a dish that is quite simple. So unlike a number of curries can have many, many ingredients and lots of, intricate steps, this recipe is really 5 or 8 curry powders and spices, and you just boil up chicken drumsticks, for an hour, which is pretty simple for an Indian dish. So it was something that you could do really quickly after school or when you came home from work. But having the key spices,
What are they?
was the thing that made it special. So you fry it with some cinnamon and cardamom pods, and the fragrancy of those is just extraordinary to me. But the one that's hardest to get, that we all often struggled, particularly when we stayed in cold countries, were curry leaves. And I grow a curry leaf tree on my balcony, and I'm really proud of it. It's probably the proudest one I have, plant. Because for me, when I know I've got fresh curry leaves, I'm going to have a wonderful chicken curry based on that. So when we were in England, it was hard to get fresh curry leaves. When we were in Tasmania, even Zimbabwe, it was quite difficult. So when we stumbled across curry leaves, either fresh or frozen or wherever, then we would immediately think we were going to be able to make this chicken curry. So that just gets fried in the ghee with those spices, and then you put some turmeric, the problematic coriander, and a little bit of garam masala, and then you fry your chicken drumsticks, and then a couple of chopped tomatoes, and then some boiling water, and let that bubble away for an hour. So it's actually, quite simple. I think anyone can do it, particularly if you've always been intimidated by an Indian curry with so many ingredients. That's a really good entry-level dish to do. And it's the aromas of it that comes off it that I just associate with comfort and home, coming home from school and smelling those fragrances in our home and hearing the bubbles of the curry on the stove. They are just all aromas and sounds of home and togetherness and safety and comfort. So, yeah, that dish is a dish now that a lot of people do make because it's in that book. And I will hear from people from very, very different, ethnic backgrounds who that has become their favourite dish in their family, which is just so lovely.
Talk me through the 5 continents, 8 schools. Talk to me about that part of your early childhood growing up, because I'm getting a sense that your moving around was a very positive experience. Your migrant stories feel positive, the way that you approach them and you're telling them to me.
So much is perspective, isn't it? The same thing could happen to you, and you might say, I didn't like making new friends at a new school. And that would be perfectly fine, because that's a really hard thing for most kids to do. I loved going to a new school and making new friends.
New stories.
Yeah, I loved it. And I was lucky I had 2 younger sisters, so you have these ready-made friends who are there anyway. So if no kids like you or don't want to talk to you, at play break, there's going to be at least 2 people, who are going to say hello to you. And I think that, yes, I was suited generally to moving and change and that disruption. It wasn't so easy for my younger sisters, I guess. They didn't have quite the same personality. But even the way we left South Africa, we were living there during the apartheid years. So race and the colour of your skin decided everything that happened in your life. And my parents couldn't go to university there, so their family sent them to India to study. And when they came back, they couldn't be employed in their area of training, also because of apartheid racism. So they decided they wanted to leave and start new lives away from South Africa, which was a big thing to do in those days. People really didn't leave and migrate in the way that we're so familiar with it now. That was an era, the big era of migration around the world. And my families, my parents' families, all were just like, I was very young. I was only about 2 years old, but I still remember this sound of crying and wailing, people just thinking they'll never see us ever again. That was what leaving the country and your family meant to people and families back then. And because of racism and the apartheid sort of system, I wasn't legally allowed to leave the country. So my parents actually smuggled me out.
Were your sisters born at this?
No.
They just had you.
Yeah. And so when we got to the border, because we were moving to
How did they smuggle you?
Zambia.
It feels like Moses in the Red Sea.
It was a little bit like that. So when we got close to the border with southern Rhodesia, which is now Zambia, they basically just put me in the back of the car and covered me with blankets that, they'd packed in the car for the move. And my dad was quite a adventurer, but also a big risk taker. And my mum was terrified, thinking this is not going to work. I'm a baby. I've been, crying and, all this stuff. So she fed me. And then we got to the border crossing and she just hoped that I would stay quiet. And apparently she said through they interrogated my parents, and then one of the border guards that, had a long, what do you call them, the knife sword at the end of the rifle butt, basically then started poking the back of the blankets on the back seat, making sure that they hadn't hidden a body there, an adult body, they thought. But fortunately, they didn't dig too deep and it didn't disturb me. So I stayed sleeping through all of this. But Mum was certain that I'd been injured or stabbed or something, because it was, quite unexpected that they were going to do that. And so she just went into this frozen fear for the rest of the interaction. And then they let us go and we drove over the border. And then as soon as we could, they stopped the car and got out. And then Mum took off the blankets. And that was the first time she realised I was still okay and I was alive. I was just sleeping very soundly.
How does she retell that story, that after feeling story? Does she talk about it?
As she's got older, the story has become even more extraordinary. Again, she was a young mother. So the things that happen to us when we're younger, we just go, oh, yeah, we'll get through that. We'll move through it. But as she gets older now, she does think back on that and just think, what were we thinking? I mean, why would we think that would be an okay thing to do or try to get away with? But people were doing extraordinary things in those days to find a better life, to get away from
They're still doing it now.
They are. Yeah. Terrible regimes. So it didn't seem that they were doing something so extraordinary. But now when I look back and the risks my parents took right throughout their life, it was pretty out there. And the funniest thing, as my mother says now, is that it's the only time in my life that I've actually ever been quiet, because normally you can't shut me up. So at least I know I can be quiet when I have to be. But yeah.
It was like the angels were just hovering around, keeping you quiet. They were, shh, that little finger over your lip.
Incredible.
And the fact that the soldier didn't actually dig that bayonet into the blankets. Can you imagine?
I can't. No.
Can you? And Dad, what was he thinking?
He's always been a future-thinking type person. So whenever that conversation ever did come up, and rarely would he talk about it, for him it was always next. So I think part of him just never acknowledged how risky that decision was, never acknowledged the moment of, that we could have, I could have been killed and we all could have been, taken into custody or whatever it would have been. Or really acknowledging my mother's terror and fear, just like, it's okay, it's fine, she's fine, let's go on, It was always a bit like that with him.
So after you crossed the border, what happened next? Where did you move to?
Zambia.
So you stayed there for a while?
Yeah, so we were there. My second sister was born there. And my father had a job with a copper mine in Kabwe, which was a big copper mining centre in Zambia. But very soon the market fell out of the copper price all around the world, and the Zambian government couldn't afford to pay all, very much like the American shutdown at the moment, couldn't afford to pay all its government workers their wage. And so no one was getting any money. So my parents quickly realised that there was really no future in Zambia, where there was no money, no oil, no fuel, no petrol. Everything had come to a standstill. So they very quickly looked at where they could go next, and there was an opportunity to move to England. So that's where we went next.
What was your memory of the UK?
As a kid, I remember it probably as it is, just being really grey. Never remember a day with sun, always raining. But again, the school that I ended up going to, there'd been a lot of young kids who were fleeing various upheavals in Eastern Europe. So we had Hungarian and Polish kids and their families who'd gone through various, military takeovers and, stuff. And so I was trying to understand that as a kid who was also coming into a new situation. So there were a lot of immigrants in the school, lots of different languages, lots of different foods.
Where were you living in?
So we first came through Liverpool. So we lived there for a while, which was very turbulent. So it was just post-Beatles. And Liverpool was a big shipping entry point, so there was a lot of immigrants coming through there. But again, this wave of discontent in the 70s in England. There was a lot of unemployment. There was the oil crisis. And so as a little kid, I remember there being lots of street protests. And there'd be my job, because we lived above the dental practice my father was working in, and I don't know how old I was, 3.5, 4, just old enough to walk down the stairs, get to the doorstop and open the front door, get to the doorstop and get a bottle of milk that would be left there every morning and take it back upstairs. And I remember this one morning I went and did that and then sat on the doorstop for a bit, because there were all these kids throwing projectiles on the main street and there were rubbish bins burning, and clearly it was the beginning of a protest. And then very quickly it got really quite loud, and I remember my mum rushing down the stairs and to grab me and pulling me out, because there was a big protest that had come through. And
your first news story.
Yeah, and being fascinated, sitting there, front row seat to watch it. But yeah, so it was quite chaotic. I remember that time in Liverpool. And then we moved to London. And London was a very big city. I do remember that feeling as a kid, just lots of traffic and double-decker buses and lots of people everywhere. So again, very different from what had been my memories in Zambia. But a time of great flux and really exciting. There were just so many people, different backgrounds. We had a German neighbour who would make a gingerbread house for Christmas for us with lights and stained glass windows made of rice paper, and we'd have a Czechoslovakian neighbour who would come and help us make sausages. And I mean, that was just every day. There was just variety and change, and yeah.
How many more stops before you called Australia home?
Well, straight after that, Whitlam came to power in Australia and was offering these assisted migrant packages in 1974. And so we came to Australia in end of 74, early 75, and settled in Tasmania. So that was our first stop.
First stop. Finished high school here?
No.
We've got another stop.
It's very hard to keep track. My husband still can't keep track of all the moves. But yeah, we lived in St Mary's for a couple of years, moved to Launceston on the north coast, and then we left in 1981 when I was 13.
Why the moving? Why the constant? Was Dad looking for something?
I think in a lot of ways he was. I mean, like a lot of migrants, he was looking for a safe place to bring up his family. And England hadn't recognised his dental degree, so there was quite a lot of racism in the medical and dental boards at the time. And because his degree had been attained in India, the last 4 years, his surgical part of his degree wasn't recognised. So he had to resit that all over again when we were in England. So that was 10 years of studying and also working with 3 children. So England really wasn't a place that embraced us and acknowledged those skills and what I guess he and his family were bringing. So he was looking for another place to come. And Whitlam was saying all the things that I think he was fascinated by, that we're all equal, we're all the same, everyone's welcome. This country needs people from lots of backgrounds to rebuild it and build it into a multicultural country. So he and my mother, but always fascinated by those concepts. And Whitlam, as we're now discovering, was extremely unique anywhere in the world. And so to be offered passage, a job and a home, when you think about it, how we've treated asylum seekers in the last 20 years, 30 years in Australia, very, very different experience from what we went through, 50 years ago. So Australia was, I think, the golden land. But again, that South African background, they were very African, my parents. They came from 5th generation South Africans. So they had a tie to the continent of Africa, to their culture, to their food, the animals of Africa, in a way that we didn't understand because we'd only really grown up in England and Australia. So when Zimbabwe got independence, and both of them had been huge supporters of the ANC that brought Nelson Mandela and South Africa independence, so they thought, we'll go to Zimbabwe and help them with their independence campaign when they got independent in 1981, which was part of the reason. But of course, what they didn't realise, my father didn't realise, is that Zimbabwe was still going through the end part of their civil war. So it was still a very unstable place to live. And there were still people fleeing the country when we were arriving.
So where's high school? Where is high school?
So we did, I did 2 years of high school in Launceston, and then I did 3 years of high school in Zimbabwe. And in fact, it was Chaplin High School, and it was a very famous school because the head boy of my high school went on to become Prime Minister of Rhodesia, Ian Smith, a very famous figure in Zimbabwe history. And my high school turned 125 years, last Saturday. And around the country simultaneously we did school reunions, and I went to ours here in Sydney with a whole lot of other ex-students who were now living in Sydney. But we had parties in Mykonos, in New Orleans, all over the world to mark these 125 years at Chaplin High School. So yeah, it was an interesting time because the year I went to Chaplin High School, it had been an all-white school because Zimbabwe was also under very similar apartheid rule to South Africa. So my year was the first time that black students were allowed for the first time. So it was a very volatile year of the white students and the white teachers not wanting black students in the school, and the black students being marginalised and deprived of education for all these years. And many of them in my class had been fighting in the Civil War as child soldiers. So I was suddenly in a class with a 18-year-old, I was about 14, who hadn't gone to school during the war, but he was my level of education, and, either missing a hand or horrific burns all over his skin. And so I would have conversations with him, and he'd been living as a child in the jungle, being forced to fight by the guerrillas against the Zimbabwean army at the time. And I'm this 13-year-old thinking, oh my God, that was another kid who's now seen the sorts of things I couldn't even imagine, and been, horrifically abused. And he's the kid who's sitting next to me in history now for the next couple of years. So the things I learnt in Zimbabwe, it like fast-tracked my understanding of injustice, discrimination, what war does. And it was a beautiful country. It was a food bowl of Africa, and the war completely decimated it. It brought on terrible famine. They got a new prime minister that everyone thought would be a new Nelson Mandela, but Mugabe ended up being a terrible despot, and the country very quickly just fell apart. There were lots of warring factions, shortages of food. I would line up once a week to get a block of cheese because I was the only one in the family that liked cheese, and to line up. Everyone would say, I'm not lining up for 5 hours. And that's what I do every Monday afternoon, where we'd get different foods rationed. And we stayed on, even though a lot of our other friends and colleagues and schoolmates left and went, got to get out of this country. We stayed on until the bitter end. And there were some full-on things because my father was working as a dentist in the Air Force Base at the time. That was his job. He was the dentist. And all those planes on the Air Force Base, there was a terrible terror sabotage attack that the South African government, which was white, South African government at the time, had planted sleeper cells in the Zimbabwean Air Force Base. And so when South Africa became independent, some of their operatives were still active in the Zimbabwe military, and they were trying to stop Zimbabwe becoming independent and blacks winning rule. So and they were always blowing up oil.
Did you feel safe?
That's the interesting thing about being a child is you just go, you don't really have an understanding.
So you accepted this as normal?
I knew it wasn't the way we used to live, but it just became another way to live. But
that takes a particular constitution to be able to kind of take that on and keep walking the planet, right? No? Yes?
As an adult, definitely.
Yeah.
But this is the thing that always amazes me about children. You can normalise almost anything as a child, and it's only years later you look back and probably have the sort of PTSD trigger and went, hang on, that was a tank in our high school, or that was a dead body.
Like when you look on that last bit of cheese on the cheese plate and you know that once upon a time you had to line up for 5 hours. Are you throwing that piece of cheese out or wrapping it up very nicely?
I'm always careful about food. I hate wasting food. I hate food waste. And now you bring that up, it could come back from those years where
you know the value of
preciousness.
Yeah.
Absolute preciousness. And having access to things that all these students who were suddenly thrown into school with me just didn't have any of those things. I remember arriving to Zimbabwe with a Walkman. Walkmans had just come out, and all the kids would line up and take turns of listening to my Walkman.
And you were happy to share it with them?
Sure.
Yeah.
And I'd put my earphones around and my headset on their head, and they'd go, wow, just to see their face. They'd never heard
What was
of
the music
that way. This was the funny thing, because the music of Zimbabwe was all reggae, R&B, house music, but the big band in Australia at the time was, In Excess, which they didn't like at all. They didn't like In Excess music. So they didn't like the music they were listening to on my little cassette, but they sure enjoyed the experience of it. So, yeah, look, I learnt that sense of gratitude and thankfulness, I guess. And then we did eventually have to sort of evacuate, and we all, flew out via South Africa to get out of there. And yeah, the country then plunged into a terrible civil war again, more shortages, more control from the government, military takeover, dictatorship of the media, of everything, and went through a terrible 10 years. And hopefully now that Mugabe's gone, there's, some rebuilding that they can do. But it was such a beautiful, rich, lush country when we arrived. It's very sad. But, I haven't been back to Zimbabwe since I left there as a kid, but maybe now's a time to go back.
Do these early childhood experiences give you understanding? I don't want to use the word appreciation, but understanding really of what's going on in the world right now?
Yeah, I think I see it on lots of different levels. So I see it through a journalist's eye. which is big picture and policy and he said, she said. And then I see it as a global citizen who is just very sad that anyone's living in these conflict areas or going through any of these famine shortages. But yeah, I see it as someone who can almost feel it. Like I can almost taste the desert dust in Gaza. I can feel what it must be like for a child to see a tank go through Ukraine. Because those memories as a child are very deeply seared in me. So, yeah, hopefully that increases the empathy that I feel for those situations.
Let's move on to your second food memory. Italian meatballs,
Yeah.
the survival dish.
Yeah. Yeah, like university for most people is a survival. Like, how do you pay for everything? How do you feed yourself? First time away from home. And meatballs, I quickly discovered, were a very cost-effective way to survive. You could make a lot of them with cheap mince. You could freeze them, keep them in the fridge. They were nutritious, so they kept you going through the long nights of study. And it began my fascination with Italian food, actually. So despite my background with Indian and African spices and dishes, I love Italian food. And I've been to Italy 15, 16, 17 times, and I love the regionality that on one side of the river they'll do it like this, and on the other side on the mountain, no, we never put that ingredient there. And their passion, the Italians' passion for their food and how to do it just right. And so those meatballs, funnily enough, and my passion have taken me on so many food adventures. Like one of them was I was cooking meatballs at an event, at a food event, and the Italian Tourist Bureau was there or something. And they said, asked me about what I loved about Italy so much, and I explained and how many times I'd been there. And they said, well, tell us when you're going for your next food thing and we'll support you and take you places. And it just so happened I was writing a couple of food pieces for Gourmet Traveller. And one of them I wanted to write, because I'd become fascinated from growing herbs on my garden, was pesto and the origin of an authentic pesto, because I was on this quest to make the best pesto in the world. And Gourmet said, that would be a great story. And the Italian tourist people helped me get across to Genoa, where pesto originated
Supreme.
from. And took me to these glass houses all along the mountains of Genoa overlooking the sea, where they grew these particular Genovese basil leaves that you cannot grow anywhere other than those volcanic soils and those mountain tops. They've got a minty quality to them and they're picked very small. And people would lie on planks suspended over the basil and hand cut leaves. And this they'd put in the centrifuge with the pecorino cheese from Sardinia, the local olive oil. Everything was all local and sun ripened. And to this day, it's the best pesto I've ever had in my life. I've kept on doing it very similar to the way that they do it, but you just can't.
Do you pick your basil at that
really,
moment?
I do.
Yeah.
I don't let the leaves get too big. And I make it in a mortar and pestle, actually. I find that still keeps the green, that beautiful rich green colour of the pesto. And I have that on my meatballs and spaghetti. And so those meatballs have taken me all sorts of places. It appeared in another. I was a contestant on MasterChef, Celebrity MasterChef, a few years ago, and I made the meatballs as my dish. Bummed out terribly. Couldn't cope with the pressure of cooking with all the lights and, Matt coming along and tasting while I'm cooking. It was very nerve-wracking. But the meatballs were included, and it was a big downloaded dish. And since then, everyone keeps requesting these meatballs, and they're nothing special compared to everyone.
Tell us, how do you make them?
But there's an ingredient in there that I gleaned from my makeup artist at SBS, and her mother makes these meatballs with ricotta cheese. And that's what keeps it creamy and fluffy and gives it that lightness that a great meatball should have. So I owe Rena's mother that little secret. And then the rest is a really good quality veal and pork mince with a little bit of beef, fresh garlic, I chopped some onion in there as well, lots of fresh herbs, basil and parsley, and then breadcrumbs and an egg, and voila. But it's the ricotta cheese that really gives it a unique flavour.
Your time in Adelaide studying journalism, what was that like?
I was so lucky when I look back on it. I had
Everything you've spoken about,
I'm the luckiest person I know.
You come out of the shit bucket with the gold coin every time.
Yeah. I mean, people do say you make your own luck, and I believe in that as well. But I just had these two extraordinary parents that just took risks that I would never take, now in my life. So I can't even imagine how they did those things. And then I had these situations that they kept putting us in, that there were people around all the time that were protecting, showing, caring, leading. It's been a very, very lucky life. And Adelaide ABC, wow. These cadetships are as rare as hen's teeth. They give 5 away a year, 1 in each state. And I got the South Australian one. And then had that amazing training I was telling you about for a whole year. But the people in the newsroom were so generous. Again, generous with their knowledge, with their wisdom, their experience. They were tough on you. I wasn't good enough to go on air for 6 months. No, your voice is not up to scratch. Your writing is terrible. This is the standard. Watch Andrew Ollie. When you're that good,
My
we'll let
God,
you on air.
Andrew Ollie.
Yeah, and that was the sense that they had, was that it wasn't. Of course, you would get better as you got more experience, but there was a standard, and there wasn't this sense that anyone can be a broadcaster, anyone can write anything. I mean, everyone can talk in front of a microphone, and everyone can write, but there was a sense in the ABC's cadetship training and really its commitment to broadcasting and journalism that it had to, we were the standard of excellence. Everything had to be exemplary. So that was also what I was trained in. Our voice teacher was a soprano, an operatic soprano, and wow, what I learnt about the voice and breath and how to use your voice in different ways that she taught us. So yes, I just had excellence all around me in every way, and even people who weren't doing journalism as say, but people who were creating sound podcasts at the time and these sound dramas.
What were they calling?
They were really radio dramas. There was one show called Poetica, run by Mike Ladd, and I was so impressed with his sounds. And we would just go on walks through the suburb together, and he would train me how to listen. And he'd say, "What do you hear?" And I'd go, "I don't know, a bus." He goes, No, listen more. And it was the first time that someone made me listen, really. And then I'd hear the strains of someone's television coming over the fence, or a lawnmower buzzing, or a dog, or some schoolgirls laughing in the playground. And suddenly I could pick up all the layers of sounds that we don't tune into very often, and how every other sound gives you another sense of what's going on. So, for instance, the birds on my balcony, I know what's happening with the weather from the different sounds of their tweets, when rain's coming, or there's going to be a flock of cockatoos flying in. Just from the note, I've learnt to listen to them, and I can see and hear danger from their perspective as well. So Mike taught me a lot about sound and listening, and how much a human voice gives away. What an amazing instrument it is, that it's very hard to hide your fear or hide your anger. Your voice is very affected by all the emotions you're feeling. So if you learn to hear someone's voice, you can hear and understand what they're feeling before maybe they even understand that that's what they're feeling.
How did you manage your voice during some of those hairy reporting times?
Yeah, it's really, particularly when I was at SBS and we were covering a lot of terrible, the Srebrenica massacres, the massacres in East Timor. It was really difficult, and we'd be doing live crosses to our reporters on the ground, And I'd feel so bad that I was in this very safe, clinical environment away from any of that. And I could tell from them, talking to them before we went on air, that there was so much anxiety in their voice. I mean, and I could hear, either the noise of trucks or gunfights or whatever it was. And I just thought, how odd must it be for you standing in this moment and talking to me in this studio on the other side of the world? And I realised that what my role was to try to reassure them, to calm them down. And I had to be calm, though. You can't calm someone down if you're not calm. So that calming yourself down and the quietness, and I do that by going to the studio a bit earlier and just sitting in the quietness and the stillness and just hearing my heartbeat just gently quieten as well. And so when I got them on the phone, I was very calm, as calm as I could be. And so that was helping them be calm before they had to then talk to me about, the situation that they were trying to cover. So, yeah, it's about understanding the unnaturalness of really what our job involves a lot of the time, of being in a situation of real danger, but having to be still and quiet and focused and talk down a camera or a microphone as if you are completely across this and you know what's going on. And these people are sitting in their lounge rooms on the other side of the world wanting essentially reassurance from you. They want to know you're across what's going on, you're telling us what's important, but everything's going to be okay, even though you don't know that.
Do you still get the same joy out of being in media and having a voice into the Australian home?
It's such a privilege. You go through periods of time where you do take it for granted, or you are exhausted and you don't want to do it anymore, or it's just like chatting to anyone. And then there are times, particularly when we were in COVID and in lockdown, and I was hosting a national radio show. So we had the highest audience listenership that my program had ever had in its history, and been around for 30 years, because everyone was in lockdown and the only thing they could do was listen to ABC radio or ABC television. And so I had this, what every broadcaster loves, I had this audience that was locked in there and they couldn't do anything but listen to you. But then, of course, the circumstances that they're don't know if they're going to live or die. They haven't seen their family or friends. They haven't been out of their house. And the only contact with the outside world is you and your voice. And because it was a national show, we had people all around the country going through very different things. So people in Melbourne who'd been in lockdown on and off for a number of years were just at the end of their tether and just thought the rest of Australia didn't care about them and was just letting this happen to them. And then I had listeners in Western Australia and Perth that never went into lockdown. They were surfing every night and they didn't want to hear about lockdowns. Can we talk about something else? And I had to keep this national audience all together at the same time, but they were experiencing this, huge historic event in very different ways. So I realised I really grew up as a broadcaster during that time, because it was a very different role. Like, it wasn't like the way I'd seen it before was...
It was the Dear Indira role.
Yeah. The way I'd seen it before was very much like, I've got information, I'm going to give information to you. What do you think about that? What do you think about that? Oh, we'll talk about that tomorrow again, Whereas this was much more life and death, like much more, are we going to be okay? Are we still going to be alive tomorrow?
Did you believe we were going to be okay?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. But then there'd be things where I didn't know what that was based on. I didn't have any more knowledge or evidence than anyone else did. And I remember this nurse, I used to do a 1-hour quiz, which was such a wonderful way for a disparate audience to connect and be together. And this nurse rang up and I said, "Oh, how are you going?" And she said, "Oh, I'm in hotel quarantine." And I said, "Oh, okay. How long have you been in there for?" And she said, 4 weeks. I went, 4 weeks. Yeah, 4 weeks. I was exposed in the hospital and I'm still testing positive, so that's why I have to stay in here. I haven't seen my husband and 3 children in all that time. I thought, oh, you poor thing. I couldn't even imagine that, right? And then the next week the quiz would come around and Helen would call again and she was still in hotel quarantine. And I was just, I'd go through my week and suddenly I would experience it like Helen. And I think, imagine I'm complaining. I can go and leave my house and go to the studio and broadcast, and there's Helen in a hotel room on her own without being able to see her family and friends. And then the quiz would come around and I'd pray that Helen wouldn't ring up, that she had got out, and there'd be another week. Hi, it's Helen from hotel quarantine. And she gave all of us such a wonderful insight into, she was so optimistic and upbeat. So I couldn't believe she was chirpy and she was just joyful. And it really made me think about how to experience gratitude, that you can have things taken away from you, but if you're still alive, wow, there's still a lot to be grateful for. And eventually, 7 weeks later, she tested negative and they let her leave hotel quarantine. And she called later on, and she would call afterwards and just say how important ABC Radio particularly was, and our show, of getting people through those lockdown moments, late at night, weekends particularly. And so for me, broadcasting and the importance of it, and the importance of the ABC particularly, going into lots of rural areas, because my show went to 54 different radio networks around the country, 1 million people. You just saw the importance of it, especially then we covered bushfires and floods very soon after COVID. And we were giving information, showing people how to evacuate, which roads to turn down, again, in lots of different states that I wasn't in, but that was the information, that we were getting from the RFS. So this sense of radio broadcasting as a form of real survival, a communication survival mechanism, I'd never really thought about it quite as intensely as this last period of time. And so the privilege of playing a role in that, to get good, important information to people, to keep them well and safe, I've valued being able to do that a lot more.
Speaking of nature has been hugely responsible for supporting you through grief and loss.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful story about the fig tree.
So speaking of COVID and the lockdowns, my younger sister Monica was living in Melbourne during that time and sadly took her life during the first lockdown. And because of the closed borders and limits on the numbers of people that can be together, we went for a very small funeral, but it was very quick. We couldn't stay there with her family because of the restrictions on movement, so we all had to come back to our other cities and states. And so it's very hard to grieve when you can't be with your friends and family. So it was a doubly hard grief and loss because of the situation and the COVID lockdowns. And so I found myself really relying on these ISO walks that we were all allowed to take within 5 kilometres of where we lived. And this one I was very lucky because I live near the Botanic Gardens. And so this walk was really special. And I'd go down the hill from Potts Point, through Woolloomooloo, up around the gardens, along the edge of the harbour, and then back again. And I'd do that walk every day. And I was doing it for quite a few weeks. And then one day, I was just a bit tired, a bit overcome by the grief. And I just remember sitting down on some lawn and then just sort of burying my head in my arms and just sitting there. And then I felt this real warmth on my face, and I looked up and this sunlight had come through the branches of a tree that I was sitting under, and I just looked at it, hadn't noticed it in all the weeks I'd been walking past it until that moment, and it was the most beautiful tree I had ever seen, with branches that spread out, a couple of 10 metres in either direction, and these really strong limbs and a really warm, embracing trunk.
Life.
Yeah, it was an amazing tree. And I got up and I walked around it and I just really looked at it and noticed that it was probably a Moreton Bay fig. And I rang up the Botanic Gardens and said, can you tell me something more about this tree? And they sent one of their horticulturalists to meet me when I was doing a garden walk. And we had to be isolated, so he was like on one side and I'm on one side. And he was telling me that the tree was planted probably in 1812 when the gardens were first established. So it was, over, 170 years old. And how resilient this tree was. It had survived all these bug attacks and different diseases, but somehow it was still here. And it reminded me that when it was planted, it would have seen all these things from the hill of Woolloomooloo when the Woolloomooloo Wharf was the main wharf in Sydney. So it would have seen people arriving from different countries, people arriving for the gold rushes. They're now soldiers leaving to go to the wharf fronts. And then, of course, it would have seen the last pandemic as well in 1918. And it made me realise that this tree had seen so much and so much death and life, so much more than me, but it had survived and had been really resilient. And not only had it survived, but it kept on making shade for other creatures and the bird life and the ants that I noticed around the base of it. And that tree gave me a real sense of hope and resilience that I really needed to feel, I guess, in that moment. And it became this wonderful friend. So every time I went for my walk, I'd sit under my tree and have a little natter to it and ask it how it was and what it had seen that day. And the certainty of knowing that even though we didn't really know what was going to happen in those lockdown years, I knew the tree would always be there and I could always sit with it. And the wonderful thing about when you're going through a loss or a grief is people really don't know what to say, or they get a bit afraid to be with you or around you. And then you feel bad because you don't know what you're going to say to help them, because you're getting through it yourself. But the wonderful thing about a tree is it doesn't need to hear anything from you. It won't say anything back to you. It just is, and you can just be. And it was a really important, I do a lot of work now in the grief area with a lot of organisations. And it was a really good lesson in understanding that often when someone's going through a loss or grief, a tree taught me this. The best thing you can do is just be with them.
Yes, it is a fantastic approach and interaction around this phase of life, this end cycle of life. What gives you comfort when it comes to loss and grief?
One of the things I learnt, I did a lot of reading, a lot of medical, scientific and spiritual reading around the idea of grief, because it really was one of my first big losses that I'd ever had in my life. And I'd always thought that was a good thing, that I'd got to my 50s before I had a big loss. And I realised that it was actually a lack and that I hadn't had any experience. Even when my grandfathers died before I was born, my grandmothers died. We weren't very close. They were in another country. So I didn't have any muscle memory to get me through this. And so through my reading, one of the things I discovered was that you can only grieve if you've loved, and the size of your grief is the size of your love. So if something dies and you don't feel any grief, it's because you didn't really love that thing that much. But when something or someone dies and you feel a really overwhelming grief, it's because there was an overwhelming love. So it made me realise that's a good thing. So to feel grief shouldn't be something that we're scared of or we're afraid of. It's actually a sign that you loved, and you loved really deeply. And also, especially through poetry, I've always read a lot of poetry, but during this time, there were a number of poets that I was reading a lot. And one, John O'Donoghue, who's an Irish poet, talks about how what we try to do is, let's just have a good time today. And if anyone says anything sad or bad, we go, don't tell me, don't do it. But what's really going on is that those griefs are happening at the same time, that you're having a party or you're having a drink with your mates. Those griefs are happening at the same time. So rather than pretend they're not happening, what we should learn to do is understand that life is a combination of celebration and grief, that we hold one in each hand all the time. Every day we're walking down the street, there's celebration in one hand and grief in the other. So I think that the growth of gratitude, grief is very good for that. It makes you appreciate what you have, what you've lost. You know, people are so fearful of losing people in their lives, so fearful of losing things, that they don't quite understand that grief is an important lesson. So much of what I've learnt is from my losses and griefs rather than from my gains and successes in a way, because they show you what you're really made of. They help your heart fortify. So I'm not afraid of grief in the way that I used to be. I'm not afraid of loss. But what I try to do is sit in the moment of that joy or that appreciation, because I know that you don't know what's going to be around that corner, and that everything, like my tree showed me with all the creatures around me, is that they all understand. Birds every day, those ants, you know, most ants live 7 days. And I had, for instance, with my sister, I had 48 years with her. Did I live those 48 years with her as intensely as that ant is living those 7-8 days? No, probably not. You know, I probably wasted a lot of time that we could have been doing so much more together. Whereas that ant in 7 days is meeting someone, they're having babies, they're growing and building a nest, they're picking up this, they're doing that. They're creating compost for us, for other creatures to appreciate and live off as well. Wow. Imagine if I lived my life like an ant. I'd sort of pack so much more into it, you know. It would be a really amazing experience. So I think gratitude is really important in our life. Counting your joys constantly. Reverse bucket lists I'm really big on. Rather than thinking about all the things you want to do, think about all the things you've already done, all the things you have, all the things you've experienced, all the people you've met. And if there was one thing I could say is that it's going to come around so quickly, all these changes. You know, my life is just, I feel it's just gone sped by. I might have another 20, 30 years left, but it goes so quickly. And so much of our society is structured around focusing on what you don't have and encouraging you to be unsatisfied and unhappy. But there's so much that we have that you could spend a lot of time appreciating and valuing and, yeah, being happy and joyful for. And grief will take, you know, it will fast track that feeling when it happens.
Your last food memory is the Wayside Chapel Christmas lunch in the street, which is linked to your social cause, ending homelessness. Why is this food memory so important to you?
Wow. The Wayside Chapel, I've learnt so much there as well. And it's hard to believe that's just one street away from where I live. So many people, when they want to discover things, find their spirituality and work out what's going on, you know, they go to an ashram or they climb a mountain or go on a trek to Nepal. And I'm lucky that the Wayside Chapel is one street away. That's what it is. You step into that building and every one of your every stereotype you have, every assumption is just left at the door, because the people you meet and the people you interact with challenge everything, you know, that people grow up thinking if you're homeless, this is something you've made happen because you didn't look after your money or you didn't get a good job or you didn't study well at school. And when you spend time with people who are experiencing homelessness, you know that nothing could be further than the truth, and that any one of us could be homeless with just a couple of steps happening, a relationship ending, losing your job, you know, having a medical emergency, and any of us could be exactly there as well. And so places like the Wayside are so important because I don't think our society really understands that. I think we blame victims too readily. And so many of these people have been victims of our situation. You know, they've either come from difficult family backgrounds or they've got an addiction, which isn't a crime, it's a health problem. Or, you know, as we're all going through now, you know, there's not enough housing basically around anyway, even for people who can afford to be housed. The prices are skyrocketing. So the homeless friends and visitors that I've made there have taught me a lot about the real causes of homelessness and how, as one of the wealthiest countries in the world, we could stop this overnight. We did during COVID. We took every rough sleeper off the streets of Sydney during COVID. So don't tell me it can't be done. We did it as a country, and we're all still here, and the country hasn't, been bankrupted by it. But I think because we help people who are homeless in our suburb, so they're people I see and, I pass by, I see on the bench. And so it really makes me, really proud that our community is proactive, whereas most communities around Australia don't have a way to look after their homeless people. And the thing I've also learned is how much you can learn from people who are homeless, and that just because you're homeless doesn't mean that you aren't an expert at something, or you don't know how, have skills that you can share. So we've built a rooftop vegetable garden at the Wayside that I helped build, and in the early stages was running gardening classes. The food we grow is used in the cafe downstairs, and that cafe then contributes to this beautiful Christmas meal that we share every year on the street. We close the street and we serve up to 800 people last year. And they are either housed or homeless. We don't ask people, you only have to be homeless to be there. It's about the community coming together. And just to see all those people together.
And what is being served at this street party?
The usual sort of Anglo Christmas, roast turkey and ham, all the trimmings. We get donations of beautiful fresh seafood and prawns. It is a meal for kings. It is stunning. But to see everyone in our community all sharing a meal and one long table together is just truly amazing.
How long have you been doing it?
Well, on Christmases, so I'm doing it this year, but some Christmases we're not there, we're staying with other families, so I'm not in Potts Point. But I think the first Christmas I joined there was maybe 25 years ago, and I've been an ambassador for 15 years. So maybe, I don't know, 15, I've done 15 Christmases, I guess, over the years there.
How can people get involved with the Wayside Chapel, in particular for this Christmas
Yeah,
night?
just go online to the website. We've probably got all the volunteers that we need for the actual Christmas lunch, but what we'd love is a Christmas plate donation. So you can go onto the waysidechapel.org, I think it is, website, and there it'll list the donations that you can make. Donate a plate for $50, $25.
We have an MFK Fisher serve it forth tradition here. Oh, you know who MFK Fisher is?
Yeah, of course.
Where our previous guest gives you a dish. Our previous guest was Zoe Tarakis, and they toyed with the idea of they wanted to give you serve you dul mothers, but they toyed with the idea of doing warak enab, which is the Arabic version with mince in it. But that's our Zoe. They like to toy around with everything. So I think they are going to serve you both. The dul mothers, the vegetarian version, and the warak enab.
Yum.
What would you like to serve our next guest?
This could be controversial because when I did MasterChef, they wouldn't let me cook this meat because they thought it would make the viewers go a little bit, ooh. But I really love kangaroo. And we've got a lot of kangaroo. It's a beautiful meat. It's an environmental meat for us to have. And I would make a kangaroo mince burger, which is delicious. And just do it very simply in a nice soft potato bread roll with some lettuce, tomato.
You've thought about this.
Oh, yeah. It's really, really good. And some pickles. It's delicious. It makes a really good burger.
Dear Indira, I wish you and all your loved ones a very happy Christmas and see you back on the telly in 2026.
Thank you, and thank you for a beautiful conversation. I really enjoyed it, Alice.
My pleasure. That's it for this episode of 3 Food Memories. Be sure to share the plated love and check out our 80-plus back episodes. They're still as delicious as they were when they were freshly rolled. For all things TFM, head to the socials at 3 Food Memories. For more info and to send us a message, head to 3foodmemories.com. 3 Food Memories is edited by Lauren McWhirter with original music by Russell Torrance. Nasta kalafili and bye for now.
Thank you for listening to Papa's podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe and tell your friends.